Hi, everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way, an American Gods podcast. I'm Alistair Stevens, and this week we are turning our attention to chapters 3 and 4 of American Gods. We're going to have some adventures, first off. First, we're going to stay a little longer in Eagle Point, and we're going to deal with the resurrected Laura. That's a really interesting scene. There's a lot there to discuss. And then we're going to push on to Chicago, where we are going to interact with, some very curious figures. We'll talk about them when we get there. You can interact live via the YouTube chat, of course, right here next to the live video feed, or you can communicate on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW, STORMSOTW. I will also be sure to post the audio version of this week's lecture a little more swiftly, a little more rapidly than last week. There were some delays in the appearance of the lecture version, or the podcast version, I should say, of the session in the feed. All of the demons have been slain. All the dragons have been slain. We are now ready to do the thing. We're just going to do it properly this week. It's going to be just fine. Pinky swear. Let's take a look here at the YouTube chat and welcome everyone. Kate is here, and Princess Ostrich is here, and Aaron is here, and Sarah is here. Sarah is currently in the midst of a cyclone, which is pretty terrifying. Cyclone Cook, a hurricane, I guess. Hurricane Cook. Yes, that sounds completely terrifying, Sarah. I hope that everything is okay down there. And Vivian is here, and GJ Corbin is here, and we are ready to go. And Becca is opening with a discussion point that I would like to hit first. These chapters, she said, seem to go so fast. And it's perfect in a way that I spent so long last time talking about the peculiar pacing in this book, talking about the way that Gaiman will expand and contract the pace of the novel to stunning effect. As I was sitting down to prepare for this week's session, I was thinking, okay, so I can do all the Laura stuff. That's all great. I'm ready to talk about all of that. And then I guess I just talk about the Fates a little bit, and I talk about Chernobog, and I don't have to get to the moon because that's next chapter, really. I mean, it has to be, right? And it isn't. It isn't. It's all in this chapter, and it moves so swiftly. The Laura chapter, chapter 3, is still expansive. It is still slow. The kinetic drag of Eagle Point on Shadow's perception, Shadow's, I don't know, his perspective on the world is so marked at this point that everything seems to take forever. And then when we get to Chicago, things collapse and we move through, again, much more dense prose. Chapter 4 is much more like chapter 1, chapter 3, rather like chapter 2. And I do not think for a second, that is unintentional. No, a lot of people, I think, are commenting about how fast this book is moving, too. I mean, here we are moving through into chapter 4. This is the second session of 11 that we're going to spend looking at American Gods in its entirety. But the last session, we're going to look at the attendant short stories. There are 2 short stories written in this world that we're going to cover. So we're really only going to spend 10 sessions on this book, and we're a fifth of the way, or by the end of today's session, we will be a fifth of the way through the novel. So we really are moving at a pace here as we go forward, and the book is keeping up with us. The book is sustaining that pace. It is an enormously readable, absorbing, compulsive novel. Yeah. Aaron says, I talk with Russian immigrants living in Chicago daily. He wrote that family so perfectly. I have never spoken with Russian immigrants who live in Chicago, but I can only imagine that is true. It certainly has the air of authenticity to it. Yes, I'm not at all surprised to find that it is completely accurate. Before we get to all of that, though, I did talk a little in the first session about my plans to talk about the TV show, about my plans to talk about the Starz adaptation of American Gods, for which I'm sure we are all very excited, with which I'm sure we will all be entirely consumed for its 8-week run. And I'm glad to say that I can now make the announcement of the form that will take. The first episode of the Starz show airs on April 30th, during which there will be a Storms on the Way live tweet. We will all gather together and tweet the hell out of the first episode of this show. That's assuming, I should say, that Starz continues with what has become a tradition. All of the Starz original programs air the previous midnight on the Starz app. So they're available almost 24 hours before the show airs live, as it were. So we get the opportunity to watch it first on our own and kind of absorb it so that we can gather together for the live tweet. I'm hoping that they're going to continue to do that. I see no reason why they wouldn't continue to do that. So if they do, then we'll live tweet it. If they don't, then we probably won't live tweet it because that's distracting the first time that you watch a show. So we'll figure out something to do there. We'll maybe schedule a repeat viewing live tweet later in the week if that's the case. Then on Monday, May the 1st, that's the day after the first episode airs, I will release a podcast discussion of the first episode featuring my two fantastic co-hosts. I can now announce this: Daphne Olive and Elizabeth Stevens of Common Room Radio, and more specifically Fathoms Deep, the fantastic podcast dedicated to the Starz original series Black Sails. They are magnificent. Daphne and Elizabeth are just incredibly astute, incredibly insightful, incredibly entertaining too. They have a remarkable gift of perceiving the shape of the story, of delving into character and theme and metaphor in a way that I think will be perfect for American Gods. So I'm very much looking forward to discussing the show with them. Those podcasts will release every Monday at noon-ish, depending how long it takes me to edit, assuming that it takes me any time at all to edit. And then on Tuesday of every week, we're going to continue with these live sessions right here on YouTube, looking at the next 2 chapters of the book. That will keep us busy until the end of June, when we will conclude, hopefully, with a big live Q&A session. And I haven't yet checked with Elizabeth and Daphne, but if possible, we'll do some kind of real live Q&A session with the 3 of us. I guess not here. Daphne doesn't live here, but you know, we'll figure some technical solution out so that we can be here and we can take live questions and we can talk about the show as a whole. If you haven't already followed Elizabeth and Daphne on Twitter, then you absolutely should. Daphne is at Daphne Olive, excuse me, DaphneOlive. Elizabeth is at LizBethRae555, LizBethRae555, and you can definitely follow Black Sails Cast for Fathoms Deep, which is just an amazing show. And if you're looking for something to fill the time between now and then, I recommend Black Sails. First of all, in its entirety, all 38 episodes of Black Sails are now available, and brilliant. I mean, brilliant. And then go listen to Fathoms Deep, which is, if anything, I mean, the show's real good, you guys, but the podcast is really where it's at. So I'm so excited to talk about the show with them. If you know them at all online, you know how brilliant they are. You know how insightful they are. And I can't wait for those discussions. It's going to be fantastic. I've only seen, says, let's see, we're looking here at, oh, and Elizabeth points out Daphne may actually be visiting in June, so maybe we will all be gathered together for that Q&A. Who knows? That would be serendipitous, to say the least. Yes. Yes, Starz is not terribly expensive, and their catalog of original programming is now, I think, more than sufficient to justify it. Even without American Gods, I think that Starz has been doing things in the TV space over the course of the last few years, which a decade ago we would have associated with HBO. I think that they are absolutely the most interesting content creators right now in that kind of cable premium space. So I can, without any kind of fear of advertising commitment here, say absolutely that the Starz app is probably worth it. Yeah, good. Good. Okay, yeah, we're just talking about all the ways that it's available internationally. There was an infographic put out on Twitter. I will see if I can link to that and retweet it, because it's, as ever, international distribution for TV has not yet caught up with, what do you call it, the internet. So there are still problems, there are still challenges associated with seeing these shows overseas. Hopefully we'll be able to find an easy resolution to that. Hopefully we'll be able to make this show available. Hopefully Starz will be able to make the show available to everyone without too much trouble, but we'll see. Yeah. Yes, good. Okay. Oh, Robert says, what's the hashtag for this one? The hashtag for this one is Storms on the Way, or is actually Storms OTW. STORMSOTW. Robert, lovely to have you here. Yes. Yes. Aaron says, tried watching Black Sails, but by the second episode, the blonde lady and John Silver threw me out of the story too much. I completely understand that. I am actually a Black Sails season 1 defender. I like it more than most people. But in general, the consensus is that season 1 is by far the weakest season, But it's also, conveniently, the shortest season. It's only 8 episodes. So if you can power through that, and I would say that the last episode is extremely good. So if you can power through 7 episodes to get to that point, your faith will be rewarded. Your investment will be rewarded. Yeah, good. Yes, as Kate says, Black Sails starts in a difficult way for the first-time viewer. Absolutely. All right, so let's get into it, and we're going to begin not with Chapter 3. We're actually going to begin by looking back at Chapter 2. I moved very rapidly through Chapter 2 at the end of last week's session, because these are hard-locked to 90 minutes. I have a 90-minute window to talk about American Gods, so it is possible that week to week we're going to slip just a little. if necessary, I'll just add an extra session at some point where we can play catch up and do some Q&A. So don't worry, everything is going to get discussed. I'm not going to just skip over huge sections of the text in order to, maintain this facade of a schedule. Instead, we're just going to take our time. We'll put our focus and our attention where it needs to be. And if we end up not covering all of the slides that I have prepared this week, we can pick up next week and maybe add an extra session too. But we are going to begin with chapter 2, and we're going to begin with Shadow's memory of a story. It is necessary, but also unavoidable when reading American Gods to keep track of Shadow's dreams, to pay close attention every time he has a dream or every time a dream is even referenced in passing. The dreams are very significant, and in Gaiman's defense, the text really draws our attention to them. It really places a primary emphasis on Shadow's dreams. So we're going to take a look at what is a mentioned dream here back in chapter 2. With the headlights gone, the world was dark. Twilight faded into night. Shadow kept expecting the act of walking to warm him, to spread warmth through his icy hands and feet. It didn't happen. Back in prison, low-key Lysmith had once referred to the little prison cemetery out behind the infirmary as the Bone Orchard, and the image had taken root in Shadow's mind. That night he had dreamed of an orchard under the moonlight, of skeletal white trees, their branches ending in bony hands, their roots going deep down into the graves. There was fruit that grew upon the trees in the Bone Orchard in his dream, and there was something very disturbing about the fruit in the dream. But on waking, he can no longer remember what strange fruit grew on the trees, or why he found it so repellent. So, of course, we pay attention to the stories that Shadow was told in prison, because the stories that he was told in prison are his primary means of navigating his transition back into what we might think of as the real world. As he emerges from prison with his dedication to staying out of trouble, as we discussed at length last week, one of the ways that he does that, again, as we discussed last week, is to pay attention to these stories, to look at these cautionary tales, and thereby to determine his path, to determine the right approach to dealing with each and every situation. This is slightly different because this is more explicitly symbolic. This is more explicitly representative, but no less true for that. We talked a lot in the first session about the power of myth and the power of stories to speak to a deeper truth, a truth that is not perhaps factual, but is nonetheless powerfully true. And of course, as we're looking ahead to chapter 3, we might think of the strange fruit that grows in the Bone Orchard, the things that emerge from the graves of the dead. We're going to talk about Laura in just a few minutes. I do want to draw your attention to the way that language shifts here. Again, throughout chapters 3 and 4, Gaiman is powerfully conscious of the structure of the language that he uses. He will collapse sentences down into their simplest, most elemental forms in order to communicate moments of great emotional magnitude. We've seen him do it before. We'll see him do it again. But there is another approach that he takes, and that is a cyclical, repetitive, dream logic kind of structure. And that is present most often in Shadow's dreams. It's present in moments of magic, moments of heightened realism, or magical realism, anti-realism almost, in a sense. Look at the way that we shift our tone here from the very beginning. With the headlights gone, the world was dark, twilight faded into night, Shadow kept expecting the act of walking to warm him. This is simple, this is punchy, this is absolutely direct. But then by the end of this passage, there was fruit that grew upon the trees in the Bone Orchard in his dream, and there was something very disturbing about the fruit in the dream. But on waking, he could no longer remember what strange fruit grew on the trees or why he found it so repellent. Look at the repetition of fruit and trees and in his dream. We're slipping here into a more poetic, more musical kind of language, but certainly a kind of language that stirs us emotionally rather than intellectually. We are not getting simple communication here. We're not getting direct information. Instead, we're getting a sensory response from Shadow. We're getting a deeper insight into Shadow's POV. The repetition of in his dream, it feels metronomic almost, certainly rhythmic at least. And we might even speculate about that rhythm. We might even question whether the kind of sharp, almost monochromatic language that Gaiman uses when we descend into those moments of high emotion, those moments of operatic intensity for Shadow, whether that sharp, cleaving language is most effectively juxtaposed with this language, this rhythmic language, the rhythm perhaps of Shadow's internal life, the rhythm perhaps of Shadow's heart. There was fruit that grew upon the trees in the bone orchard in his dream, and there was something very disturbing about the fruit in the dream. But on waking, he could no longer remember what strange fruit grew on the trees or why he found it so repellent. There is a rhythm there, but also an arrhythmic cadence there. And we're going to continue to track the way that Gaiman plays with language, the way that he elevates and then collapses. Because when he elevates language, he draws it up slowly. He builds, even as we see through this passage, he will build it and build it and build it until it becomes something other, something almost organic, something almost fluidic. But then oftentimes when it collapses suddenly. It is destructive, it is jarring, it is barbed, it is, the entire superstructure is blown away and we are left with steel beams jagged against the night sky. That's what Gaiman does with language, to impart that emotional intensity and also to draw us into Shadow and to break us out from Shadow, to break us away from his POV. Yeah. Gene says, one reason I enjoy listening to Gaiman's narration of his own writing is because of its rhythm. It's a unique insight into how he infuses poetry into his prose. If you haven't heard Neil Gaiman read any of his own work, definitely go and do that thing, because she's entirely right. Even in its most conventional moments, Gaiman's prose does carry a poetic awareness, I would say, more than an outright attempt at poetry. There is a conceptual kind of inclusion there right at the heart of the prose. But when it breaks out and it begins to, when that tree limb starts straining for the sky, when we really start elevating our language, then you can see the poetry coming out. And it's a poetry that was already there and was already considered and is now being revealed. But yes, yeah, good. Brian Fuller is going to have such fun with this imagery, says Mariana Trench. This is why, we're all excited about American Gods. I think even before there was pre-release material, the trailers and what have you that are out right now, Brian Fuller seemed like the perfect pick for American Gods. His ability to weave magical realism is, I think, unparalleled on television. I can't think of anyone who does it better on television. So you're absolutely right. I think he's going to have just a ball with this. Yes. Yes. And as Robert Hickok calls out here, Norse dreams were of great importance. Sometimes they were poetic, a product of Odin. Often they portrayed the future in some way or explained current events. Yes. We can talk about this, he said, refusing to give spoilers. We can talk about this a little more fully much later in the book. The degree to which Shadow's dreams specifically reflect the conventional approach to dreams given to us by Norse mythology or by Greek mythology or even that kind of Western medieval mythology, we can look at that and try to determine exactly what kind of dreams Shadow has been having this whole time, because there are a number of different ones. And if you feel so inclined, do keep a list of them all, because I think there are breaking points in our understanding of his dreams, which will become only apparent much, much later in the book. Yeah, good. And Gene says, I wrote an entire paper on Gaiman's rhetoric through his sentence structure and syntax for a university course. Gene, if that is available online and you would like to share a link to it, please do that thing. Yes. And Mariana Trench says, this is fascinating. I hadn't thought of this before, but the USA does seem to have a prison mythology too. Yes. Yes, absolutely. There is. I may need to think about this more, but you're right. There is a very specific, emergent, mid-20th century kind of prison mythology in the heart of United States culture. That's a very, very interesting thought. Yes, let's be mindful of that and maybe talk about that in a future Q&A. That seems like the kind of place to pull that up. Good. Yeah, yeah. Good. Okay. So that's our yes, keep a Shadow Dream journal, says Angela. Yes, good. Yes, excellent. Let's take a look at The second thing that I wanted to talk about, which we glided over completely at the end of last week's session, and that is, of course, Shadow's abduction. We absolutely have to talk about this because it is going to be of such primary importance later, yes. The glinting fiber optic lights inside the limo continue to change, cycling through their set of dim colors. It seemed to Shadow that the boy's eyes were glinting too, the green of an antique computer monitor. You tell Wednesday this, man. You tell him his history. He's forgotten. He's old, and he better accept it. Tell him that we're the future, and we don't give a fuck about him or anyone like him. His time is over. Yes? You fucking tell him that, man. He's been consigned to the dumpster of history while people like me ride our limos down the superhighway of tomorrow. I'll tell him, said Shadow. He was beginning to feel lightheaded. He hoped that he was not going to be sick. Tell him that we fucking reprogrammed reality. Tell him that language is a virus and that religion is an operating system and that prayers are just so much fucking spam. Tell him that, or I'll fucking kill you, said the young man mildly from the smoke. Got it, said Shadow. You can let me out here. I can walk the rest of the way. Yes, and we are already pulling out. We are already pulling out the most interesting thing about this entire sequence. And for this, we must remember that this novel was written in 2001. Well, what was written in 1999 and the year 2000 was published in 2001, and the world was a very different place. And sometimes it can be difficult to track, particularly for our younger contributors to this conversation, the breaking points in technology. But let me assure you, as an old man who had been on the internet for many years already by the time 2001 rolled around, this already feels anachronistic. This already feels outdated. This feels like a conversation that occurs in the movie Hackers. This feels like a 1992 vision of our cyber future. It doesn't feel consistent for 2001. It's not quite there. And we can tell that Gaiman intends this by the last line of that first paragraph there. It seemed to Shadow that the boy's eyes were glinting too, the green of an antique computer monitor. We haven't used green screen monitors since the 1980s. And yet here we're deliberately invoking that imagery as a part of this stab at the future. Now, we talked a little last time about the setting of American Gods and exactly when and where it takes place. It is clear, I think, throughout this entire interaction that this is not supposed to be contemporary. We are leaning on the idea that this character, about whom we shall have more to say in the weeks to come, that this character is referencing an idiomatic approach to technology that is already somewhat out of date, that it's already not entirely quite there. And that's both intentional and I think enormously purposeful, because it speaks to, well, it's always difficult to be sure when and where the penny drops for, hey, coin metaphor, where and when the penny drops for readers with this book, when readers figure out exactly what is going on here. Nothing has been made absolutely crystal clear just yet, but certainly by this point, even in the narrative, we're beginning to have our suspicions. And certainly by the end of this week's reading, I think a lot of readers have kind of anticipated the movement of the story, which isn't bad. That creates a beautiful dramatic irony. That creates a discontinuity in the knowledge of the reader versus the knowledge of the character, in this case, Shadow's personal knowledge. But here, the idea that this character is referencing a kind of language that is already somewhat passé, that is already somewhat anachronistic, and that anachronism is being blurred back into the past, back to antique computer monitors, I think is completely deliberate. These characters are reactive. These characters grow from well-watered soil. I'm picking my words very carefully so as not to anticipate the final turn here, but that is necessarily a reactive characterization. That is necessarily a reactive nature. They come along after, they follow on after, and that is going to be vitally important as we look at the flow of belief and growth as we move through the book. So that's something to keep in mind even here. I think that from the first introduction, it is supposed to be deliberately discordant. It's certainly not the case that Neil Gaiman was ignorant of computer technology back in 2001, and it's certainly not the case, I think, that this is supposed to blur our understanding of exactly where and when American Gods takes place. I think this is mindful. you know. There are a couple of questions here that are approaching spoilers that I'm going to. Okay, we really hate this character, you guys. I do agree, for what it's worth. He is the worst. Yes. Remember the Millennium Bug, you guys? Asks Mariana Trench. Yes, yes. This is so 2000s and the fear of tech, says Sarah Thomas. Yes. Yeah. And Elizabeth says, this is the most incongruous part of the story for me, but damn if I'm not compelled. Yeah, this is an early stab at framing between I guess, Bilquis at the end of the first chapter and this incident at the end of the second. We are definitely expanding our sense of the world already. And I prefer, while there is no question that the Bilquis scene is much more powerful, is much more visceral, much more compelling. I would honestly argue just better written. I think the Bilquis scene is outstanding. There is a primacy to this scene by virtue of Shadow's presence. And there is a discussion, an ongoing discussion, particularly here in the author's preferred edition, about the degree to which the breaks from Shadow's POV serve the narrative and the degree to which they undercut the narrative. And that's something, again, that we can be mindful of as we go forward and then discuss right at the end. Yeah, language is a virus, indeed. Language is a virus. Good. Good. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Kate says, Robert is asking me to read this in the Dwarven accent. I don't think I'll be doing that. I don't think that's necessarily the right approach, but this reading is going to stretch my acting abilities about as far as they can go. So yes, but perhaps, hey, Patreon stretch goal, I'll read pretty much anything you want in the Dwarven accent. I'm good. All right. Yes. Oh, Death or Glory Toad. Also, Robert calls out on Twitter, Green Mile, Cool Hand Luke, Shawshank, and many more movies reflect this American prison mythology. That is beautiful. That is absolutely beautiful. And I talked last week about the role of mythologies, of accreted collections of myths in defining and identifying communities and cultures. And when you have been deprived of your native community and culture, the ability to seek new definition, the ability to seek and adopt and almost perform new identity is of vital importance. We see that in expat communities, we see that in subaltern communities, you know, all over the place. I think if you are challenged in your ability to define yourself, as you explicitly and purposefully are when you are incarcerated, then the ability to adopt and to create a new persona, a new cultural persona, and to weave that into your personal identity is of paramount importance. So it actually makes a lot of sense that prisons would lean so heavily on this idea of their own performative myth, though of course we have to be very careful to disassociate actual real life prison from prisons as depicted in pop culture. You know, there is an open question, and I would be interested in your thoughts on this, whether or not prison mythology is a product of prison, or prison mythology is a product of the society that encapsulates those prisons and looks at them. Is this organic? Does it arise from within? Certainly there are stories that do. There are personal accounts which absolutely do. Or is this a story that we are telling ourselves about our stories? You know, is this a piece of cultural reflexivity here, or is this a more organic and more commonplace kind of myth making? Yeah. Right. Good. Language as a virus is a fun concept also covered in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, says Jonathan Nash, which has a fantastically intriguing vision of the future. Would love to hear others' thoughts on that series too. Jonathan, I can reassure you, I will definitely be talking about Snow Crash at some point. I don't know exactly when, but that is a book. I get possibly more requests for Snow Crash and Ready Player One than I get for pretty much anything else, which says a lot about the people who listen to my podcasts, honestly. Both are fascinating. Both are now completely anachronistic. Both represent a very specific time and place in modern popular culture and in the evolution of the digital age. You know, I think both of those books speak very interestingly on those topics. So yeah, both Snow Crash and Ready Player One, maybe some kind of two-part seminar looking at both. I'll figure that out, but it is definitely on the list. Yes, good. Ready Player One, says Princess Ostrich in all caps. Yes, yes. Aaron says, wait, more for Snow Crash than for Neuromancer? Yes, weirdly, William Gibson has not aged as well, has not maintained his popularity. I would argue that Stevenson has kind of taken Gibson's throne as the herald and the prophet of the digital age. I'm a huge fan of all of Gibson's work, and Neuromancer is my single favorite, and I would love to talk about that at some point too. But when we talk about science fiction that has dated badly, Neuromancer does run into some problems of anticipation there. William Gibson was unfortunate among science fiction writers in that he lived to see his future, his proposed future, basically become real. And when that happens, it can be difficult for the fiction to maintain the same presence and the same momentum. This is something that has afflicted science fiction writers throughout the ages. Yeah. Language is a virus. I'm not going to get pulled into this, Gene, but I will read your comment because this is fantastic. Are there benevolent or beneficial viruses in the way there are good bacteria? Language can be likened to a virus in the way it is copied and evolves, but virus has a typically negative connotation. I cannot get sidetracked into talking about this, even though I would love nothing more. Yeah. And Aaron says, I've reread Gibson and Snow Crash. Snow Crash seems far more aged to me. It is, absolutely, because it was so much more specific. Stevenson was really drawing upon a very specific time and place. And of course, if you do that, you're perfectly at liberty to do that as a storyteller. But if you do, as soon as that time and place has become eclipsed by the new future, the new tomorrow, then your book reads as anachronistic. Gibson, by separating from reality, a few more steps, by pushing a little further into the future, managed to avoid that to a greater extent. Neuromancer, again, arguably maybe his most problematic book in that regard, but the vision of a technologically connected society, there are questions raised in Gibson's work which seem enormously powerful and enormously potent within the frame of the fiction, which we have by this point in history resolved fairly trivially. So again, big Gibson fan. This is not to say that his work is not without merit, but in terms of the popular culture, I think right now Stevenson has a little more weight. It would be really interesting to see a decade from now or 2 decades from now whether that remains true. It may be that Gibson has kind of arrived at his level, that he is going to remain consistently present in our pop culture discussion of technology and this kind of informed society. But Stevenson may fall further. We'll just have to wait and see how that works out. Yeah. As Angela says, Gibson was pre-tech and Stevenson post-tech. I'm talking a lot about cyberpunk, you guys, for a seminar that is supposed to be about American gods. So let's drag this back. Yes, as Sarah says, you have time for Gibson, but not language is a virus? Yes, this is absolutely fair. Let's wrap this up. Let's move on because we haven't even hit this week's reading. You guys, we haven't even hit this week's reading. Let's get to, whoops. Again, my slides being just a little twitchy. I think there might be a bug in the system here. Let's get into then chapter 3 and talk about, well, let's talk about Shadow thinking about Laura. Don't go there, thought Shadow. He decided to think about something else. He thought about coin tricks. Shadow knew he did not have the personality to be a magician. He could not weave the stories that were so necessary for belief, nor did he wish to do card tricks or produce paper flowers. But he liked to manipulate coins. He enjoyed the craft of it. He started to list the coin vanishes he had mastered, which reminded him of the coin he had tossed into Laura's grave, and then in his head, Audrey was telling him that Laura had died with Robbie's cock in her mouth, and once again he felt a small hurt in his chest, in his heart. Every hour wounds, the last one kills. Where had he heard that? He could no longer remember. He could feel somewhere deep inside him anger and pain building, a knot of tension at the base of his skull, a tightness at the temples. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, forcing himself to let the tension go. We should perhaps observe the epigraph here. Every hour wounds, the last one kills. More commonly translated as all hours wound, the last kills. That is in Latin, and forgive me for my Latin is very poor indeed. Omnis vulnerant ultima necat. This is a traditional Latin proverb. We don't know its provenance, but we do know that it was oftentimes inscribed on sundials as a reminder of our own mortality and the temporal nature, the temporary and I guess temporal nature of existence. Yes. Let's look first, I guess. Well, even at this point in the narrative, there is a striking and powerful line that rings through this book like a bell. And every time I read this line, I get a little shiver, as though you can actually feel the echoes of these words in the subsequent pages and chapters. Shadow knew that he did not have the personality to be a magician. He could not weave the stories that were so necessary for belief. He could not weave the stories that were so necessary for belief. Definitely put a pin in that, you guys. That one's real important. Then we move on to the practice of coin craft, and he's not interested in the magic of magic. The magic of magic is, as is implied here, in the story. It is the entire trick. It is in the seduction of the audience, the subversion of expectation, the dizzying reveal. It is in the surprise. It is in the entirety of the thing, and he has no interest in the entirety of the thing. He just wants to practice the craft. And I talked last time about the drinking of the mead and how even when rituals have no power, there is a means of arriving at that power through the observance of the ritual. Sometimes doing the thing is sufficient. Sometimes faking it allows you to actually make it. Shadow here is kind of replicating that, but with no further intent. He is focused not on the greater purpose of the thing, not on the representative purpose of the thing, but on the thing itself. And in this way, he is distinct from, well, again, I hesitate before I make declarative statements, but perhaps distinct from every other character in this book, at least all the primary characters in this book, because their eyes are always raised. They're always on the horizon. They're always on the end as well as the means. But this is Shadow's focus on the here, the now, the craft, the doing of the thing. And we must, by this point in the book, be mindful of the significance of coins and of coin tricks. This is going to pay off tremendously much later in the book. We'll talk a little more about coins, I think, when we get to the end of chapter 4, right at the end of this week's reading. But here we are, almost halfway through today's session, and I'm not making as much progress as I hoped. The coin thing drives me crazy. It simply has to have some more meaning than just a running gimmick thread through the story, says Robert Hickok. I would argue that it does. In a couple of different ways, honestly. Coins are enormously symbolic, and are indeed actual symbols. A modern coin in particular, is not in and of itself valuable. It is only representatively valuable. Coin tricks and the manipulation of symbols themselves, that does seem to me to be very thematically important to the heart of the book. It does seem to me that Shadow's manipulation of a symbol is itself a symbol which ties into the other symbols. This is a metaphor about metaphors, almost. It is a manipulation of things which are themselves representative. So I think there is something there. And of course, when we're talking about America, when we're talking about Americana, we can't divorce the discussion from consumerism, from commercialism. We can't divorce any discussion of America, of the United States, and of the emergent cultures of the United States from a discussion of commerce, simple economics. And the specificity of the coins, I think, is also important for that reason. We've already seen Mad Sweeney's gold coin that was tossed into Laura's grave. By the end of this week's reading, we'll have another coin of a very different sort. We'll look at that when we get to it. Yeah. Good. Hard not to be spoilery about coins, says Sarah. Yes. Angela says coins are very important in myth. Also true. Yes. Good. Right. Yes, and Mariana says, interesting that Shadow isn't a storyteller. I feel like that's significant. Yes. Yes, very significant. Or okay, let's be a little more careful here. Shadow feels that he doesn't have the personality necessary. Shadow believes this to be true, that he can't be a magician because he can't tell the story that is necessary for belief. Again, let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. We can discuss the degree to which that is actually true later as we go forward. And of course, here too, we see really we bracket this entire chapter. We bracket this entire chapter with the secret hurt at the heart of Shadow. He wants desperately to be stoic. He wants desperately to present himself as stoic. We talked a lot last time about his brooding nature, about how engaging that is, about these hidden depths. But here we have cracks in Shadow's facade. It's only chapter 3, and we're getting to see the guy. We're getting to know the guy. or at least we're getting to know his primary pain, his primary vulnerability. And vulnerability, as I've said on many podcasts through the years, is exactly how we access character. We understand people by the things which matter most to them. And this is obviously the case for Shadow, that he has this compulsive instinct to think about Laura, even though he doesn't want to. He's drawn back to her and back to her and back to her, and drawn back to the circumstances of her death. This act of betrayal that serves as a punctuation mark and now cannot be resolved, or at least we believe cannot be resolved. He believes that this has been quite literally laid to rest, except that it hasn't, because human emotions don't work that way. I would also call out, let me just show this slide for another second here, because of the end of that first paragraph is just beautiful. He started to list the coin vanishes he had mastered, which reminded him of the coin he had tossed into Laura's grave, and then in his head, Audrey was telling him that Laura had died with Robbie's cock in her mouth, and once again he felt a small hurt in his chest, in his heart. What I was saying earlier about the elevation of language and then the sudden brutal collapse of language, it's evident right there in that chapter. Look at that sentence structure. He started to list the coin vanishes all the way through to, once again, he felt a small hurt in his chest. That sentence structure is out of control. It is stream of consciousness. And then we punctuate it with a sucker punch, with a bright blade that cleaves through all of the elevated language to that simple truth in his heart. That is, and Shadow said nothing, and Shadow shook his head. That is this elemental muscular language that we discussed last time. Yeah. Rachel says, all he's been thinking about is her. Of course he's still thinking about her, and what he's missing is one part of his three things he'll never get. Yes, yes, completely true. Or at least we believe he'll never get. The one promise, Rachel says, oh, beautiful. The one promise to himself he's forced to break. Love it. Absolutely right. Good. Okay. Yes. Let's move on to the next slide then, as we move into Shadow's dream of statues. And I did say that this chapter read quickly, and it certainly does once Laura shows up, but wow, there is some density before then. This takes a little while. Sleep took him then, without Shadow noticing. He was walking. He was walking through a room bigger than a city, and everywhere he looked there were statues and carvings and rough-hewn images. He was standing beside a statue of a woman-like thing. Her naked breasts hung, flat and pendulous on her chest. Around her waist was a chain of severed hands. Both of her own hands held sharp knives, and instead of a head, rising from her neck, there were twin serpents, their bodies arched, facing each other, ready to attack. There was something profoundly disturbing about the statue, a deep and violent wrongness. Shadow backed away from it. He began to walk through the hall. The carved eyes of those statues that had eyes seemed to follow his every step. In his dream, he realized that each statue had a name burning on the floor in front of it. The man with the white hair, with a necklace of teeth about his neck, holding a drum, was Lucutios. The broad-hipped woman with monsters dropping from the vast gash between her legs was Hubor. The ram-headed man holding the golden ball was Hershef. We'll talk a little about the nature of this place, the nature of these statues on the next slide. But again, just to emphasize Gaiman's utter, conspicuous, almost somewhat excessive mastery. Again, we're forced to confront these expansions and contractions of language. Look at that, the long sentence there in the middle of, I guess, what is the third paragraph on the slide. He was standing behind a statue of a woman-like thing. Her naked breasts hung flat and pendulous on her chest. Around her waist was a chain of severed hands. Both of her own hands held sharp knives, and instead of a head rising from her neck, there were twin serpents, their bodies arched, facing each other, ready to attack. And then we cut back to Shadow backed away from it. Again, that stream of consciousness expansion in the prose, and then the almost brutalist action that Shadow takes, the almost, there is there no poetry, there is there no sense of metaphor. It is a sudden collapse, as the collapse into brutal language is. It is a sudden collapse into literalism. And one of the ways, I think, of looking at this contrast is to look at the contrast between metaphor and literality, I guess. Yeah, good. So let's cut right ahead here. To the next slide. This is the voice that Shadow is hearing as he is moving through his dream. The voice spoke once more as if it were addressing a class, saying, "These are the gods who have passed out of memory. Even their names are lost. The people who worship them are as forgotten as their gods. Their totems are long since broken and cast down. Their last priests died without passing on their secrets. Gods die, and when they truly die, they are unmourned and unremembered. Ideas are more difficult to kill than people, but they can be killed in the end." This is an absolutely vital passage that speaks comprehensively to the heart of the novel. Even by this point in the narrative, we are inclined to believe, I think we are led to believe, that this is very important. But it is important in a way that is almost elusive. It is almost contrary to human experience. We have all, when faced with death, when faced with loss, when faced with simple absence, we have all, I think, as human beings, accustomed ourselves to the idea that death occurs, but then there is memory. And certainly that's what Shadow's dealing with as he deals with the death of Laura. Yes, this death has occurred, this life has come to an end, it has reached its terminal punctuation, and yet, memory persists. And that conflict between what is remembered and is thus present, and what is dead and is thus absent, that tension is, I think, in some sense, the root of grief. Can also, of course, be the root of hope, can also be the root of regret, can also be the root of fortitude. These things are enormously powerful. Human beings are defined in part by our awareness of what is absent. You know, the curse of object permanence basically forces us to live our entire lives burdened by those things which are not with us, which are not present, which are either separated from us by time, by space, by death. But that's not how it works for gods. Gods can't be remembered after they die because their death is the act itself of forgetting. They are reduced and diminished to nothingness until when they die. It is not tragic. It cannot be tragic because no one cares. That is fundamentally inhuman. That stands in sharp contrast with all that we understand of death and the process of loss. So we must remember, as we're moving through this book and we're thinking about death and loss, that these two ideas are fundamentally opposed, that they can never be meshed. We can never build a bridge between them because they are inhuman. You know, the idea of loss as a complete absence of self, that even memory is, in a sense, even memory is taken as a part of death, that is inhuman. And thus, we can't intuitively, emotionally connect with it. Now, Gaiman is going to go to some lengths to secure that, to communicate that to us. But we have to be aware, right in the here and now, that these two things are very different. It's very tempting to draw a somewhat shallow comparison between Shadow's loss of Laura and the loss of these ancient gods, unremembered, unhallowed now. But it would be wiser, I think, to draw a contrast rather than a comparison, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. Yes. And this is, a few of you are pulling out, Louis L'Amour's Lonesome Gods. Yes, there are a few people who have taken ideas very similar to this, both before Gaiman and after Gaiman, and have done interesting things with them. One of the most interesting perspectives on this kind of theology comes to us from Terry Pratchett, from his Discworld novels. Pratchett and Gaiman, of course, were friends in real life and got along famously and wrote together. And Pratchett's perspective is, of course, more acutely humanist than Gaiman's perspective is, as one would expect from Pratchett. But those two ideas are very compatible. And as you say, Louis L'Amour has engaged with very similar ideas. There are, yes, fantasy novels and science fiction novels and literary novels all through the 20th century and beyond, which deal with a similar kind of idea, this reactive existence of gods, that gods spring forth from belief rather than vice versa. Yeah. Good Omens, y'all. If you haven't read it, says Jean. Yes, yes. If it's inhuman, says Mariana, why does it make me want to cry? Because, Mariana, you are human. And the idea of something being unremembered is difficult for us because that is a permanent loss. That is a loss that is itself inhuman. That we take comfort and solace from the idea that the dead will be remembered. We have built entire social structures, cultural institutions on the idea that the dead and the absent will be remembered. That is an act of honor, and it is an object of value for us personally and culturally speaking. So the idea that that can be not just not true, but also a necessary component of the death in the first place, it does tug at us. It does, I think, challenge our understanding of death. Yeah, yeah. Good. Okay. As Rachel says, this is even more tragic in an American context with indigenous people being forced out of their worship, gods forgotten by force rather than the lack of worshippers. Yes. It is not simply the case that, I mean, it is literally the case that gods were forgotten, but it is not simply the case that gods were forgotten by neglectful worshippers, by the march of technology or the march of progress, except I suppose in the broadest possible sense. Yes, the forced destruction of religion in this context takes on a very different aspect. And you're right, Rachel, it's a troubling one. Yeah. Sarah says there was a TV show in New Zealand called The Almighty Johnsons that was Norse gods coming to New Zealand as average Kiwi blokes. Very good. Kind of want to see that. If anyone knows if that's available online anywhere, please let me know. A New Zealand show called The Almighty Johnsons. Kind of into it, Sarah, not gonna lie. Kind of into it. Okay. All right. So that is Shadow's dream. And of course, then we get to the heart of the chapter. Then we move with great purpose into, I guess, honestly, one of the definitive sequences in the book. This is one of the most important and urgent and dramatic, emotionally dramatic sequences in the book. This is one of those sequences that I think will tend to linger in the memory after it has been read for the first time. And certainly this is one of the sequences that I think we collectively are most looking forward to in the TV show. This is the return of Laura. He knew her. He would have known her in a crowd of 1,000 or 100,000. She sat straight on the side of his bed. She was still wearing the navy blue suit they had buried her in. Her voice was a whisper, but a familiar one. "I guess," said Laura, "you're going to ask what I'm doing here." Shadow said nothing. He sat down on the room's only chair and finally asked, "Babe, is that you?" "Yes," she said. "I'm cold, puppy." "You're dead, babe." Shadow said nothing. Every time we get one of those lines, I shiver every time we get it because of the unguessed at depth, the suggested but by no means illuminated magnitude of Shadow's emotional response in that moment. It's real hard. Yeah. So here we see the return of Laura, and this is, of course, going to be a pretty major plot element as we move through the book, and I want to be careful not to anticipate the movement of the story. As I said, many of us are reading this book for the first time as a part of this particular seminar series, so I don't want to jump ahead and talk about the nature of Laura. I don't want to necessarily talk about everything that is going to happen or everything that lies in our future, in her future. I want instead to look at the specifics of this moment and what this moment represents, this moment of stark and sudden and unexpected reconnection. This is, by contrast with the previous excerpt, this is the return of memory. This is the sudden, forceful intrusion of memory into the real world. Shadow will describe this later as a dream. We'll try and cling to the idea that this was a dream, but it's not. It's starkly true we get, that's not a spoiler, we get multiple suggestions that is the case as we move through the chapter. Robert says, "I think one of the highest points of this book is how Laura refers to Shadow as puppy. Period. The end." Robert, completely agreed. Completely agreed. Yes. Yes. Jean says, "I'm not a fan of the actress who narrates her in the audiobook. I too am very interested to see the actress." Yes, I'm less taken with the performance as Laura in the full cast recording, the 10th anniversary full cast recording of American Gods. I'm very hopeful for the TV show, though. I'm very hopeful for what the show will do. Yeah, good. Let's move straight on to the next slide. I really just wanted to include that because of the ominous awfulness of I'm cold, puppy, because I just had to read that line aloud. Sometimes this is just for me, you guys. Sometimes these slides, they're just for me. They're just for my pleasure. Yes, Jean's already jumping ahead to Rachel's going back to work. Rachel, have a great afternoon. Jean is calling out a line that we'll get to in just a little bit from Wednesday, yes, which is, "Hoo boy." Smoke wreathed her face. She was very beautiful in the dim light. "You want to know about me and Robbie?" Yes. It was Laura, he realized. Living or dead, he couldn't fear her. She stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray. "You were in prison," she said, "and I needed someone to talk to. I needed a shoulder to cry on. You weren't there. I was upset." "I'm sorry." Shadow realized something was different about her voice, and he tried to figure out what it was. "I know. So we'd meet for coffee, talk about what we'd do when you got out of prison. How good it would be to see you again. He really liked you, you know. He was looking forward to giving you back your old job." "Yes." "And then Audrey went to visit her sister for a week. This was, a year, 13 months after you'd gone away." Her voice lacked expression. Each word was flat and dull, like pebbles dropped one by one into a deep well. "Robbie came over. We got drunk together. We did it on the floor of the bathroom. It was good. It was really good." "I didn't need to hear that." Perhaps the most interesting detail here is the emotionless quality of Laura's voice as she is relating this story. And again, we see this pull back into very simple language. "Robbie came over. We got drunk together. We did it on the floor of the bedroom. It was good. It was really good." Stripped of metaphor, left as naked literalism right there on the page. This is the actual, factual account of what happened. Laura's dalliance with Robbie is perhaps, I was going to say is less interesting, but is perhaps incompletely interesting without Shadow's response. Shadow is present in this story as a culpable actor. He apologizes. He understands to a certain degree, is still hurt by it, of course, in his heart, but is still nonetheless complicit in what happened. He is understanding. And yet there are limits, as we see here at the end of the slide. "I didn't need to hear that." We can infer a great deal about Laura and Shadow's relationship from this slide. The degree to which they were connected, the degree to which they were emotionally responsible for each other, the degree to which they offered comfort and solace. It is clear from Laura's specific reference of this was 12, 13 months after you'd gone away. And when she says, "You weren't, I needed a shoulder to cry on, you weren't there, I was upset," that this is more than mere absence. Though again, not the absence of absence. Shadow was gone and she had to live with the memory. Again, this is a kind of metaphorical death. The spatial absence, the impermanent spatial absence still works, still connects, I guess. So even though that is true, we're looking at it in a very different way. Laura was left alone and turned to Robbie for comfort. First for emotional comfort and then ultimately for sexual comfort. There was something that she gained from that relationship which spoke to her in the absence of Shadow. Shadow, as we know from the first chapter, had no one. I mean, Loki Lysmith was there. There were friends that he had, or at least acquaintances that he made within prison, but he had to harden himself in order to continue, in order to persist, in order to endure. He had to do this by himself, and she didn't. And even in that, he seems to take some culpability. He seems to take some responsibility for her action. He is apologetic. So I find that contrast interesting, but what is most interesting about it is the way in which it tells us, the way in which it communicates the fullness of their relationship at the time. Shadow is a gentle man, says Aaron. Let me see, we're referring to there, yes. Shadow is really gentle to her, says Sarah, but I would guess that's probably easier to do when someone is dead. Yeah. And yeah, Angela's calling out a little bit of foreshadowing. Yes. I feel so much for Laura, says Jean, and honestly, I think what endears me to both characters in the relationship is that his response to the whole thing isn't to vilify her. Couldn't agree more, Jean. I think you're absolutely on it. I think that his emotional connection to Laura still at this point, still and all at this point, their relationship has, I mean, would have metaphorically endured and has now weirdly, literally endured. She is still with him. She is still present. And in a story where we're going to talk about the death of gods, spoilers, in a story where we're going to talk about the loss of faith and the loss of memory and the loss of presence and identity, Laura stands as a contrast to that, as effectively the antithesis of that. When faith was lost, but memory endured, memory brought her back, in a sense. Yeah. Good. I love, says Aaron, that Laura is not pilloried. Absolutely. Good. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going because I've got so much to do. There is no way we're going to finish this tonight. I can only apologize. Here at least we can finish chapter 3. Can we get through chapter 3? Actually we're not quite finishing chapter 3. We've got 2 more slides to finish chapter 3. Let's do the end of Shadow's story in chapter 3 and see where we end up. This is, I mentioned earlier, the way in which this entire chapter is effectively bookmarked by the cracks in Shadow. We get, first off, his compulsion to think about Laura and to remember who she was and, of course, what she did, to feel that hurt in his chest, in his heart. This is the trailing bracket, if you like. He wished that he were mourning Laura. It seemed more appropriate than being troubled by her, or he admitted it to himself now that she had gone, just a little scared by her. It was time to mourn. He turned the lights out and lay on the bed and thought of Laura as she was before he went to prison. He remembered their marriage when they were young and happy and stupid and unable to keep their hands off each other. It had been a very long time since Shadow had cried. So long he thought he had forgotten how. He had not even cried when his mother died. But he began to cry then, in painful, lurching sobs. He missed Laura and the days that were forever gone. For the first time since he was a small boy, Shadow cried himself to sleep. Shadow's sudden emotional break here is fascinating, is genuinely fascinating. It would have been easy, and I think a lesser writer would have been inclined to pursue this path, to leave Shadow whole, to leave him taciturn and strong, and to suggest certainly depths beneath the surface, to suggest cracks. But here we actually break him. This overwhelming grief. And we should talk, I think, about the mechanic of this overwhelming grief. Laura has returned. She was present in a sense, but it's not this Laura that he's missing. He understands now that Laura was broken when he was sent to prison, that something changed, something was destroyed. Every time there is a change, it is a metaphorical death. Every time we become someone new, every time we are, and this is true positively too, every time we are freed or liberated or restored or healed or made whole once more, there is a metaphorical death. There is the metaphorical death of the us that was. Shadow is now seeing that his time in prison has led to effectively the metaphorical death of Laura, ultimately to the literal death of Laura, though that doesn't seem to have really taken in quite the way that we would normally expect. And perhaps by thinking back to his previous existence, perhaps thinking back to those innocent years, what he is grieving for too is himself. Here we have this almost this restoration of Shadow's emotional purity, his emotional innocence. This too will not stick in quite the way that we might hope. He is going to be himself again very, very soon, right at the beginning of the next chapter. But for now, this is where we are. I find that enormously powerful. The lingering effect of death after the fact, the way that death can occur years before it actually occurs, the way that loss can occur years before it actually occurs. We're getting a very complicated and subtle and thoughtful and human perspective on loss, on absence. And By contrast, we're getting this very simple, very, I mean, not morally or philosophically simple, perhaps, but at least mechanically simple perspective on gods. Gods persist until they don't. Gods persist until no one cares. No one has ever grieved for a god. But that is not true. We grieve as human beings for each other and for our past selves and for our present selves, and we grieve. We sense that discontinuity between what is and what ought to be, what is and what was. That's humanity. And I guess to take that a step further, because I am a natural optimist, because I am a believer in the greatness of human beings, it is also arguably the source of our greatest power, which is our ability to accept and to process and to move on, the ability to believe that tomorrow will be better, that things will improve, that we can, if not fix, then if we can't rebuild, then we can at least build something new. And that is going to be pivotal to Shadow's journey as we move forward too. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay. Elizabeth says, it's not this Laura that he's missing. Damn you, Scotsman. I'm not crying. You're crying. I'm not crying. I'm doing just fine. I kept that slide up for a long time just for no reason whatsoever. It's fine. It's good. It's fine. It's fine. Anyway, from there, we are going to move on to our first, not our first breaking of the narrative. We've already broken the narrative with Bilquis at the end of the first chapter. But now we're going to move into something that is a little more structural, a little more formal in its aspect. We're moving into Coming to America, 813 AD. And yes, let me see here. Am I actually... Good. I just skipped ahead a slide. I was worried for a moment that I didn't have the slide, but I do in fact have it here. I'm going to skip across this story a little bit because it is largely a vignette. It is beautifully written, of course. But what really matters is the last excerpt here. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit and skip ahead to this last excerpt from the short addendum to chapter 3. The Skreeling war party fell upon them that night, 500 men to 30. They climbed the wall, and over the following 7 days they killed each of the 30 men in 30 different ways, and the sailors were forgotten by history and their people. The wall they tore down, and the village they burned. The longboat upside down and pulled high on the shingle they also burned, hoping that the pale strangers had but one boat, and that by burning it they were ensuring that no other Northmen would come to their shores. It was more than 100 years before Leif the Fortunate, son of Eric the Red, rediscovered that land, which he would call Vinland. His gods were already waiting for him when he arrived. Tyr, one-handed, and grey Odin, Gallows god, and Thor of the Thunders. They were there. They were waiting. The coming to America of gods, ancient gods, following in the path in the wake of belief, being summoned forth, being called upon by prayer, by faith. This is fundamental. This is one of the building blocks of our understanding of this world, and it is sketched here in a way that is luminous. We're also getting very specific foreshadowing, which we'll get to, I guess, when the reveals come. But I'm sorry, we're having a very serious discussion here, and Sarah is interrupting it by quoting Flight of the Conchords. I'm not crying, it's just been raining on my face. That is one of my favorite Flight of the Conchords songs, Sarah. It's pretty good. Yes. This is a wonderful story, a genuinely wonderful story that ends not in death. Men die, men fall. These men, curiously, fascinatingly, are actually forgotten, actually lost to the pages of history. No one remembered these men, but the gods endured. These ideas are still larger, are still more powerful, and have a persistence to them. Yeah. Angela says, I think Gaiman reads this part in the full cast audiobook. He does indeed. Wonderful. And I listened to it several times over. Yes, it's astonishing. Good. Flight of the Conchord references, always applicable. Well, more or less always. Sure. Okay, let's move straight into chapter 4. We are definitely not going to get through all of this in the next 15 minutes, you guys. Let's see. Is there a natural breaking point? Yes. Okay, let's see if we can do, what do we think? 5 slides in 15 minutes? We can definitely do that, right? All right, my slides are being just awful. Here we go. Okay, so this is from the beginning of chapter 4 as we're getting ready to leave Eagle Point. You gonna miss it? Asked Wednesday. He was sorting through a folder filled with maps. The town? No. Too many Laura memories. I didn't really ever have a life here. I was never in one place too long as a kid, and I didn't get here until I was in my 20s, so this town is Laura's. Let's hope she stays here, said Wednesday. It was a dream, said Shadow. Remember. That's good, said Wednesday. Healthy attitude to have. Did you fuck her last night? Shadow took a breath. Then, that is none of your damn business. And no. Did you want to? Shadow said nothing at all. Here again, we have an interaction between Shadow and Wednesday that is absolutely predicated on Shadow's desire to believe something to be true that is evidently untrue. There is, though, here an important contrast. If you remember when they were on the plane, Shadow said to Wednesday that Laura died in an automobile accident, that there are worse ways to go. He was trying to make good of her death. And Wednesday flickered. There was a sense in which Shadow's belief was insufficient, that he was trying to fool himself and failing to. Here, there is no flicker. Here, it is evident that Shadow does not believe what he said, and nor, obviously, does Wednesday. Yes, it's okay. We're not gonna rush through anything too much here. We're just gonna try and find a natural endpoint. Yes, good. So that's basically our introduction, and of course our departure from Eagle Point. And again, here we're moving into a more dense part of the book. We get this long, elegaic, transfer across the United States. We move to Chicago, and the description of that is beautiful and spacious and full. But when we get to Chicago, the narrative again condenses, it again contracts. Everything is filled and suffused with immediate and urgent detail. These things press in upon us in a way that Eagle Point has not. Eagle Point is Laura's town. Shadow doesn't belong here. And it may be that there's a point to be drawn from that. It may be that there's a conclusion that we may draw from that. Again, we're getting these fractured hints of Shadow's past, fractured hints of Shadow's childhood in particular, that he moved around a lot, that he wasn't quite stable, wasn't quite set, didn't quite identify himself with a community, with a culture, and that becomes in itself a part of his identity, a part of his own internal narrative. So in Chicago, America, says Robert Hickok, gods of the old world, how appropriate they are, so easily forgotten. With our short memory, easy distraction from anything not related to cute kittens and squirrels. Yes, kittens are the gods of the internet, says Garrett, and hey, I'm inclined to agree. Yes, somewhere out there, Keyboard Cat is possessed of enormous power. I think chapter 4 needs its own, says Aaron. Yeah, I think we'll maybe just do a little bit here and then we'll wrap it up. Scotsmen love a losing battle, says Princess Ostrich. You are absolutely right. Give me nothing. There's nothing I love more than the odds being stacked against me. Yeah, good. Okay, let's look at this slide then and the appearance of Zoria Vichnaya. This is going to be terrible. I'm kind of wanting to stop now just so I can take an extra week to prep for these names, you guys. This is our introduction to the first Zoria. Who is the big man? She asked Wednesday. Another one of your murderers? You do me a deep disservice, good lady. This gentleman is called Shadow. He's working for me, yes, but on your behalf. Shadow, may I introduce you to the lovely Miss Zoria Vichnaya? Good to meet you, said Shadow. Bird-like, the old woman peered up at him. Shadow, she said. A good name. When the shadows are long, that is my time, and you are the long shadow. She looked him up and down. Then she smiled. You may kiss my hand, she said, and extended a cold hand to him. Shadow bent down and kissed her thin hand. She had a large amber ring on her middle finger. We should perhaps frame this discussion a little. We should perhaps talk about the Zorias, I guess, and Am I going to have time to get to Chernobog? Well, that's actually the next one. So yes, we'll maybe do one more slide here. I'm talking more about how many slides I'm going to do than talking about the content of the slides right now. This is our introduction to Zoria, the fates, effectively, the fates of Slavic myth. This is an interesting exercise of creativity on Gaiman's part, because traditionally the Zodias come in pairs. They are the fate of the morning and the fate of the evening, effectively. But he adds a third, speaking to ancient Greek myth and the depiction of the fates there. That is narratively fascinating, dramatically absolutely necessary. To do what he wants to do here, he needs threes. As we've seen already, threes are vitally important in American Gods. Threes are very important in stories, in myths too, certainly. Here, though, he manages to I think, draw this myth and kind of reframe it, kind of refocus it in a really interesting way. This introduction, though, isn't just introducing a new mythic element, isn't just introducing a new character, and, you know, stick around because this is a pattern we're going to see again and again and again. And in fact, we've already seen once, kind of. We've already kind of had a version of this with the introduction of Mad Sweeney, but Mad Sweeney is so present and so provocative in that moment that it's the sense is that he is coming to Shadow. The sense is that he is asserting himself upon Shadow's life. There's no degree, even when they're fighting, there's almost no degree to which Shadow is entering into Mad Sweeney's world. Here, though, the opposite is true. Shadow absolutely enters into this mythic and fantastical realm. He's entering into, well, again, a mythic and fantastical realm that is completely mundane, that is completely transparently real. There's no element here of magical realism, well, at least yet. The details of their everyday existence are about as mundane as you can get, but still Shadow is moving into it. Now he is accompanying Wednesday. He wasn't before, and that, I think, is a vital breaking point. We need to look at the ways in which Wednesday's presence, his actual palpable physical next to Shadow presence, alter the path of Shadow's arc through the book, alter Shadow's ability to move from world to world, how he navigates these different experiences and different encounters. We will be able to track that again as we move forward, but this is our first breaking point, in that Shadow didn't enter into the world of Mad Sweeney. He is now entering into the world of the Zodias and Chernobog. Yes. Let me see here. The food in this chapter is amazing, says Jackie. How American am I? It's all about the food. Yes. Yes. I know a lot of old Russian ladies, says Mariana. They're all goddesses. Wonderful. The food in this story, says Sarah, the food in the story is a narrative in itself. Yes, a very important narrative. There is no way that I'm going to get to it now, but there is a slide that I have here about apple pie, which will change your life. Yes, it's vitally important. Let's talk then, Robert's calling it out here. Let's talk then about the long shadow, more meaningful than first appears. The line is, Shadow, a good name. When the shadows are long, that is my time, and you are the long shadow. You may kiss my hand. Here we are at the beginning, or at the beginning of chapter 4, and we're already getting another perspective on Shadow's name. We're already getting another sense of what that represents. And of course, it is fair and literally true that the morning sun casts shadows that are just as long as the evening sun. But there is an emotional difference there. The diminishing of the shadow into day is fundamentally opposed to the growing of the shadow into night. He is the long shadow. He is the growing shadow. And that is absolutely necessary, absolutely pivotal there. Yeah, good. Yes, just wait till we get to the pasties. Yeah, yes. Yes. Robert says, well, a minor spoiler here, I guess, Robert. You better do the dwarf in a dwarvish accent, Alistair. Seriously, he ain't Slavic, Paul. Yes, okay, we'll get to that. Anyone who gets hooked on the mythology, on all this mythology, Gina's recommending the Myths and Legends podcast. I would like to add to that, definitely check out the Myths and Legends podcast. Also check out Aaron Mankey's Lore podcast, which statistics would suggest you're already listening to. You may actually be listening to it right now while you're also listening to me. The Lore podcast is fantastic. Definitely listen to that too if you're interested at all. Yeah, good. Jackie says, reminds me of when I was a kid. There was a place in Humboldt that claimed to make the best pie around. Took us years to realize it was repackaged pie from Walmart. Yes. Good, good. Yes. Excellent. Yes, pasties. What did I say? Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. We're having some pronunciation issues here. Sometimes when you talk extemporaneously for 90 minutes on the internet a few times a week, you slip up. Yes, yes, yes. Good. Okay. All right. You know what? Let's just wrap this up, you guys. I don't think we're going to make any profitable advance into Chernobog, and I really want to talk about that to give him due respect and due diligence here. So I think what we're going to do is call it here a few minutes early. If you have any questions, I guess you can chat them out now, and then we will definitely move into this later. This is disappointing, you guys, that I didn't make it through. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5 left. I guess I made it through 2/3 of my slides. That's actually not too bad. Not too bad. So, though I never intended to cover the Coming to America 1721 because that would take a handful of slides on its own. So maybe I made it through half the reading this week. Yeah, we'll do some extra sessions, and I guess there's nothing stopping us from continuing the book discussion after the TV show is over. I guess there's no actual limit on this podcast. We can just keep talking about American Gods until we're ready to. I'll just have to provide serious updates so that people can follow along. But still, the reading was chapters 3 and 4. We'll finish chapter 4 next week, and hopefully we'll be able to make some progress there. Okay, spending more time than planned. Curses, says Jean. Yes. Yes, I know. 2 chapters, Aaron says, 2 chapters in a book this dense is ambitious, to say the least. It was always going to be ambitious. It was always going to be a lot to cover, and I would rather do it properly. I would rather talk about the book in its entirety and be able to have this discussion with you all than simply, recite by rote the points that I want to make and make it through. Yeah, good. Bilbo would never steal a pie, he would pay for it, says Aaron, segueing into there and back again. Bilbo did steal pie and food from Thranduil the Elven King when he was residing in the Elven King's halls, but he does pay for that in kind with his gift of the silver necklace to Thranduil right at the end of the book. So while, yes, his act of burglary and the payment for said foodstuffs were separated in time and space, they did still take place. Baggins pays his debts, if I could slam Tolkien into George R.R. Martin there, metaphorically. Yes, good. All right, guys, let's wrap it up here. We will talk again next Tuesday. If you have thoughts, if you have questions, if you have queries, and I know that you do, you can email me directly, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. You can also use the hashtag StormsOTW over on Twitter. You can also leave comments right here on the YouTube video once the YouTube video is posted. If you are watching this not with the live chat accompanying it, but rather after the fact, then you can leave comments here, and I will see those. And sometime this week, the new Point North Discord server will go live. It won't be tomorrow, but it will be someday this week. So if you are a Patreon supporter, then you can head on over to Patreon and connect your connect your account to your Discord account. Discord is basically a chat room where we can all hang out and do this thing. We're going to use that for some future sessions. I think I might run some text chats, like some Ask Me Anything format text chats in the Discord server. Those are just going to be for Patreon supporters. So if you would like to help me do more, if you're enjoying this and would like to help me dedicate 2 sessions a week, 2 storms on the way, which I might need in order to be done with this book in any kind of efficient format, then head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. Pledge $1 a month, whatever you can afford, and that literally just makes it possible for me to do this stuff. This entire endeavor is based upon your generous support. So if you can help spread the word, if you can rate and review on iTunes, head on over to Patreon. This is the part where you do your thing and astonish and awe me as you guys do every week. I am very appreciative of your company this afternoon. The podcast will be available in the very near future. I will try and get that out to you this evening rather than, 4 days hence or whatever the last one took. That's it. Guys, thanks so much. I'm going to have to figure out Discord, says Aaron. You will, but it's easy. It's fun. It's good. Don't worry about it. Yes. Thanks so much, everybody. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care.